Okay. Intermittent fasting. This is something I do, and this is something that I think is beneficial for the body. But you see, I was thinking about intermittent fasting, and I was wondering, or rather I stumbled upon, a rather peculiar realization in terms of its philosophical implications. And I was thinking about it like this. So, intermittent fasting, obviously, if you are not aware of what it is, this just simply means time-restricted feeding, which means that there is a certain amount of time, usually about 12 to, I would say 18 hours, or some people do 24-hour fast. I guess you could also fast for multiple days if you would like. But typically, an intermittent fast would be somewhere between like 12 and 18 hours. Regardless, I was thinking about the philosophical implications of intermittent fasting and how, when you are not eating, you are obviously not consuming food. And you see, this creates a space between you and your food, or a space between the time you are eating and the time you are not eating. This is a rather prodigious space, or rather an extensive span of time. You see, I was doing some research, and at least from what I remember, it was saying that the normal person spends about 18 hours, I think, of their day eating. Or maybe it was something like 14 or 15. Either way, it was an absurd amount of time. And it was saying that the typical person eats about 7 to 8 times a day. Sometimes even more than this. And obviously, these aren't full meals, but just little snacks here and there. And then obviously, people eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But you see, this is a type of overconsumption. And this is most likely why there's all sorts of metabolic syndromes and cardiometabolic dysfunctions and endothelial dysfunctions in the world, cardiovascular disease. You see, we are a society that overconsumes. And the problem with this is that our relationship to food starts to become unhealthy because we are overconsuming it. We're not allowing space between the times that we eat. And I was thinking about why this is insightful and profound philosophically. So I was thinking about it like this. When you intermittent fast, you are creating a space between you and the food that you consume. And what this does is help your relationship to food become healthier and more advantageous for longevity. You see, when you allow there to be a space between the times that you eat and the times that you don't eat, instead of in your waking hours overindulging in food constantly, what you are doing is creating a better relationship with the food. And this also helps you to become more cognizant of what you're eating, I think, because you are spending less time consuming, which gives you more time to think. And I was thinking about it in this way. You see, on a piano, for instance, when you play a chord, there is always a space between the notes that make it into a chord. You see, from the first, there's the third, then the fifth, 7th, 9th, 11th, 12th, 13th, typically. This is in a sequential progression of notes in a scale. And what this does, when you put them together, is create what you might call a relationship and what you would call harmony. You see, a 7th chord is harmonized, and it consists of, typically, a first, a third, a fifth, and a seventh. And you see between these notes is space. And this creates the relationship between them. And subsequently, or rather, simultaneously, harmonizes them into what you would call harmony. So you see, when you create a space between the time you are consuming and the time you are not consuming, what you are doing is essentially manifesting harmony within the body. You see, when you are over-consuming constantly, you can think about it this way. And this, I think, is an easy way to think about it. So let's think about our body and our metabolism as a room in a house. It could be any room. It could be a kitchen, bedroom, whatever room that you can imagine. And if there is a person in this room, there's a good amount of space for the person to move around, to move freely and do what he wants to do. And if there's another person put in the room, this creates a little less space, and there is a little bit less autonomy for the person to pursue what he would normally be pursuing if he was alone, because you see, when there's another person in there, there's another brain, and this creates what you might call tension. And sometimes tension is good. You see, sometimes you can even implement a little bit of tension into a chord. And this can be good, or a little bit of tension into a chord progression. You see, if you play, let's say, if you play a second, let's say, in a scale, if you build a chord off of the second, and natural progression, especially in jazz, is a 2-5-1. So you see, from the 2 to the 5 is typically dominant, which creates tension within the chord progression, which then allows it to subside back down to the original home note, the 1. And this tension creates a relief when the 1 is played subsequent to the 5. So you could say that tension is sometimes important. But okay. Now let's say by some chance, this room just so happens to be filled with 50 people. And let's say this is a rather small room. You would say, well, that would be a very overcrowded room. There wouldn't be much space for you to move around. Certainly, this would not be propitious or advantageous for anyone. Certainly, you could get no work done in this room because it is simply just overcrowded. And nobody is happy. And you see, you can think about this in terms of the diet and your dietary habits. You see, if you're eating constantly, if you're over-consuming, if you're consuming too much, too rapidly, what's going to happen is things are going to become overcrowded. And your metabolism is going to start to degrade and not do its job properly because it can't, because there are too many substrates within the system. So therefore, fasting seems to be important. And even philosophically, it seems to make sense. You do not want to flood the system, to overcrowd the system with too many things. We want there to be space, and we also want there to be some sort of a relationship. But you see, even a chord can become too crowded. If you play a bunch of notes very close together, or even if you add in notes that aren't supposed to be there, it can start to crunch. And sometimes this can be a flavor which you want to implement. But this is not something that you want to overuse. So basically what I'm saying is, maybe sometimes it is okay to feast, but then there must be famine. There must be space so that the relationships remain in harmony with one another. And you see, there are diets like this. There's the 5-2 diet, which means that you feast for 5 days, and then for 2 days out of the week, you fast for 24 hours. You don't eat, you just drink water. This is like what you might call a feast and famine diet. And it seems to be rather advantageous for weight loss and cardiometabolic health. So you see, sometimes it is okay to implement, or rather, spice up and use certain flavors. But they should not be overused. These are merely just flavors. It is the same with writing, with poetry. You see, the story must be told. You must allow the reader to enter into your world, but also it is important sometimes, or rather advantageous, to implement certain flavors of poetry, certain rhythms and rhymes. It is okay sometimes to make your reader read between the lines, but other times it is important to be conspicuous, to be concise, to be precise, succinct, and compendious. This is sometimes extremely important, and other times you can implement these philosophical inquiries and rhymes and rhythms and poetries. You see, it's a combination of all of these things, and there must be balance. And balance creates harmony. You see, all of this can be understood, or rather thought about, through the diet and intermittent fasting. And this is what I began to think about and to understand. You must not overcrowd or overload the system with too many substrates. You must not put too great of a glycemic load into the body, because this is not advantageous or conducive or beneficial to your own metabolism. This leads to death. We can even think about it in terms of syntropy and entropy, in the balancing act of the yin and the yang, the light and the darkness. Syntropy is complexity, and entropy is dispersal, or decay. You see, and I think life lies somewhere in the middle of this. We cannot have too much, and we also cannot have too little. We must conglomerate, and we must also decay to stay in balance. And this is what I was thinking about. And this is why I think that intermittent fasting, not only extremely important for the body, but also philosophically profound.